This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is The Prehistory of Private Property. It's a book co-written by Carl Weidequist, the man with me, and we will be speaking about its premises and other things as well. The Prehistory of Private Property is a book that was co-written by Carl Weidequist and Grant S. McCall. I have Carl with me. He's appeared, I think, once before, maybe twice, but once before definitely on this show. And we're going to be talking about the contents of the book and other things, since he is a political philosopher. So welcome, Carl. For those people who don't know who you are or didn't see the first time you appeared a couple of years ago, can you give a brief précis about who you are, what you've written, and why you're here?
Yeah. Sure. I'm from Cassopolis, Michigan. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest. I did my undergrad at the University of Michigan. I studied economics in New York in the 1990s, and then political theory, normative political theory at Oxford in the 2000s. So I'm a little bit of a combination of an economist and a political theorist or a political philosopher, mostly a political philosopher. And my concern is distributive justice, the ethics of who has what, the justice in our societies that we tend to have insider groups who are controlling things, and we tend to have outsider groups who are subject to things but don't have much control over them and controlled by them. And we've got to think seriously about how to create a more just society, given this natural tendency of any even democratic structures to be controlled by insiders. And a lot of my work revolves around this idea. I write a lot about basic income because I believe that basic income gives power, individual power, to the least advantaged people, that gives them some matter of control over their lives and thereby control over the political system. Whereas just simply the right to vote, the right to speak, doesn't do that as much as the ability to say, I'm not going to work for you if you don't make these conditions workable for me. And this book and the last one that I spoke with on your program it's not about basic income. It's about arguments that people use to defend the inequality in our societies today, and how that a lot of them are based on a false history of our planet and false claims about how our society works and what it does. And we look in these books, we look into the claims that people make and show the importance of these claims, and that these are factual claims about our own history. And then we look at our history to show that these claims are false.
Before we get into the book, when people talk about false histories, oftentimes you get this idea of these wacky cable TV programs where aliens came to help build the pyramids and stuff.
Yeah.
But so when you talk about false claims historically, what exactly are we talking about since the beginning of time? Are we talking about since the Enlightenment, or where along the spectrum of human evolution are we talking about? Are these things that we have false beliefs in the very ground 8,000 years ago when civilization appeared, or?
Yeah, well, it's really a whole range of things, but usually it involves the claims that we're addressing are claims that involve our history, but sometimes they don't really sound like it very much. So our first book, Prehistoric Myths in Modern Political Philosophy, debunked this idea that everybody benefits from society. We've all heard this claim over and over again. We hear this claim that without society, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and everybody, even the least advantaged, benefit from society, and in tremendous ways, supposedly, we benefit society. And this idea goes back to Hobbes, whose words those are about nasty, brutish, and short. But it is actually, and even goes back, we trace it much further back than Hobbes. But these ideas are something that the people who portray these ideas don't actually put forth any evidence for them. They portray them as if it's just obvious that we're all better off, but it is not obvious, because you would have to compare the life of the least advantaged person in our society today, and most of us aren't very familiar with that, to people who live in societies that don't have governments and don't have a private property rights system and so forth. And hardly any of us are familiar with people living in society. So it's not an obvious claim. And it's a claim that has been used for propaganda. It's been claimed to justify colonialism against Native peoples outside of our societies, and it's a claim that has been used to justify maltreatment of the least advantaged in our society. Oh, you've already benefited so much that the rest isn't so important. Well, actually, no. What we have is a parasitic society. And other claims. So in this book, we're looking at claims as simple as capitalism promotes freedom. It doesn't sound like it's a claim about history, but if capitalism is the freest society in the world, well, then it has to be freer than all the other societies, including throughout history. And one of the things we look at in this book is whether or not that claim holds up. If you look throughout history, and the claim, as we show in the book, clearly doesn't.
Now, we're recording this in the year 2021. Historians of American history are going to look back at the January 6th riot or insurrection, what you call, and most people are going to listen to what you just stated and say, well, he sounds like he's talking about some kind of anarchism. And so most people, especially now in 2021, will look and think anarchism is a bunch of these right-wing yahoos that want to basically take over and reimpose Jim Crow or something. They have these, these ideas that it sounds like you're talking about a positivist anarchism, if there is such a thing.
Well, I don't really describe myself as an anarchist. What I write is very skeptical about the state structures that we have. Whether that means replacing them by anarchism or by just an improved state structure remains to be seen. As far as I'm clear. Most people who call themselves anarchists really aren't, especially the right-wing ones that you're talking about. If you have private property and no government, then what you've done is made all the property owners into kings and queens. You've just made the property owners into the government. Property ownership is government. If you make the decisions about what happens on the land, you govern that land. If we get rid of the thing we call the government and leave the property rights owner, the property owners, the landowners, the banks, and the corporations that own our land, those will be our governments. And the rest of us who either own no property or owe 30 years of loans to banks in the hopes of this long-off promise of becoming an owner someday, those of us will become subjects. And we'll become subjects to governments where we no longer have a vote. So what the right-wing anarchists are going for is the farthest thing from anarchy. It is really back to
neo-feudalism.
Yes.
So let's talk about on page 2. The book is sort of posited on sort of 3 pillars. It seems to me you make 3 claims called the inequality hypothesis, the market freedom hypothesis, and the individual appropriation hypothesis. And we'll talk more in depth, but if you can just sort of briefly sketch out these 3 sort of fundamental bars that hold up the book.
Yeah, those names are names that I've given. Well, Grant and I have given to common claims that we hear all the time that are taken as granted. What we're trying to do is look in this book at some things that are usually taken as granted and not even heavily defended, that we're all supposed to believe. So the market freedom hypothesis is the hypothesis that the market economy of capitalism is the freest society imaginable, and that all other societies are going to involve greater interference with individuals, greater interference, so more negative freedom, more coercion than this society. We look at the truth of this claim in the book. Then another claim is the inequality hypothesis, the hypothesis that a more equal society is impossible, or that the only way to obtain a more equal society is with the expense of freedom. This claim is often made, seldom is it defended in any historical sense by looking throughout the history of the world and, well, what kind of more equal systems have we had and how free were these systems? The people who make this claim seldom really defend it. They ask you to take it as obvious. And then the third claim is the natural property hypothesis. This is a claim that has really been going around at least since John Locke. This idea that private property is natural and joint holdings of property, collective property, are unnatural, other than a corporation created by private holders. And this idea, John Locke creates this great myth about it, where an individual goes off into the woods by himself, and it is a man in all these stories. The man goes off and clears the land, and the land was worthless before he cleared it. He plants crops, and he says, I own this land is mine and mine alone. And then he gets to own the land forever, and he can buy and sell and trade it. And that's how we get a world full of private properties, from buying and selling and trading from this natural development of what we all want to do. Is we all want to go out in the woods and clear the land and create a private property. Well, is that what people really want to do? Is it true that people really want to establish private property? If this claim is true, that there's something natural in the development of private property, if we look at the history of property, sure, we're going to see a lot of injustice, but what we should see is the continual effort of the peaceful people to be trying to just create their little niche of private property, and other people interfering and coercing from them. That's what we should see if we look at history. And the people who have been saying this hypothesis since Locke 350 years ago have not looked at that history and not defended their hypothesis. So all of these things we're just asked to take for given.
It seems
asked to take as given, and this book is starting to question those claims.
It seems to me that of the three premises that you tackle, the third one seems to me to be the most absurd, because clearly it seems to me that despite the rhetoric of the founding fathers of this country and other countries' claims that all rights are not innate, all rights are given by mutual consent of people within themselves. And if we don't really believe that, well, let's just wait until a society from beyond this planet comes and decides to make human burgers and see what they consider our rights. So clearly, rights are mutually agreed upon fictions that are beneficial. And to say that a property owner, or that the right to property, or that somehow this entitles one person over another, seems to me the most absurd contortion, me personally. And I'm not an anarchist. I consider myself a progressive politically, but I don't subscribe to any particular philosophy religiously or politically. But that does seem to me the most absurd. Would you agree that seems to be the most absurd of these three claims that people make?
I don't know. It's actually whether it's the most absurd. It is one that is widely believed, the belief that there is something natural about private property. Now, I actually wouldn't go so far as you to say that rights are something that are mutually agreed. That legal rights are something that is created by the legal system. And the legal system, it's a fiction to say that the legal system is based on mutual agreement. The legal system is controlled by insiders and imposed on the outsiders. And sometimes we create things that are mutually that are good, mutually beneficial ideas, like the idea that nobody should get murdered. That sounds like a mutually agreeable idea that we would all agree to. But actually, even if you look at the United States of America, that's had this right not to be murdered for hundreds of years, that it's never been equally enforced. That for a very long time, it was really okay to murder black people if you were white.
And it still is if you're a cop, basically.
And that's right. And it's still not equally enforced. The laws against murder are not enforced in a way that you would if this was established by mutual agreement. It is established by insiders, and outsiders simply have to live with it. And outsiders are continuously saying, these rules that you're made, they're unfair to me. We have to change them. And the insiders are saying, these rules are natural. So far, I've only talked about what you said about rules being mutually agreeable. Rules being mutually agreeable is something we aspire to, but rules as they are something that are made and everywhere and always made by insiders. And we constantly need to press those to make them actually beneficial to everyone. Now, to the absurdity of this claim, well, this idea that private property is natural is become very ingrained in our society. In the most Western societies, this idea that private property, what I own is what I own, and then what the government taxes is a taking from me, it's a very well established idea, and it's hard for people to think in another way. So the claim does not seem absurd to most people, but that is, I think, an outcome of the situation that we created. It seems natural to us because we don't know the history of how this system was established. And once you know that history, then you could say, yes, this claim really is absurd. And this we talk about at great length in the book.
Yeah, and that leads into the next posit, or the next section, where you basically compare what we call British society, that derived from the Magna Carta, I guess, and you compare it with the high birth ideal of Polynesian societies. So, for those who haven't read the book, so is this in some way? Do you think that it's almost a pan-human thing, that there are always those that have been in charge and always think that their being in charge is the natural way of things, whether it's Polynesia, Britain, South Africa, the Incas, or whatever?
No. This is something that happens in state society, but has not happened in small-scale indigenous societies. And it's not even certain that it always happens in state society. The belief in inequality, this is one thing we start out with in the book, in this section where we're looking at this inequality hypothesis. We look throughout recorded history at people saying that inequality is natural and inevitable and the only way that it can be. And what we do by going through this history is to point out that there's something wrong with this belief. It's very common that people believe that inequality is natural and inevitable, but they always have a different reason for it. The Polynesians believed in high birth, that some people were more closely related to the godlike people who founded the society. The medieval Christians believed that there was a great chain of being where the people who were higher born were closer to God, and the people who were lower born were farther to God, and that to earn the favor of God, we all had to accept our station in life. And in the modern era, we start to come up with these ideologies of property, that people who have a lot of money do so because they or their ancestors worked well with property, and then they benefited everyone by doing this. We've also had eugenics beliefs in that, the people who are better off are more highly evolved or better evolved than the other people. And we go through a bunch of these other really very different beliefs justifying inequality. And that should point to something being wrong with this, because if everybody can agree that inequality has to happen, then people should agree with why it has to happen. But every society has a different reason why we have to have equality, which should make you suspect that we really have to have equality, and there are societies that don't have it. The smaller scale societies that existed in places like the Kalahari and in the Amazon and Borneo until quite recently, and to some extent still exist today in remote locations, do not have an ideology of inequality and do not have significant inequality. Where when people have a problem, they talk it out. They live in a group of maybe 60 people. They have a problem, they talk it out. If they can't agree to a solution, they split up into two groups and they go camp in other places. Nomadic peoples can do this very easily. People who live in state societies can't do it so easily and tend to develop ideologies saying that it's impossible to do it. But it has been done, and it has been done for hundreds of thousands of years of people living in a strong belief that we are all equals here, and a strong belief that no one should be in charge, and really living up to those beliefs. This is well documented in anthropology. So it is not something so this belief in inequality is not something that is pan-human. It is something that is very common in state society. That's something that state society clearly makes easy to propagate this idea, but it's not something that happens everywhere and always. And even there are state societies that are much more equal than others. If you look at the Nordic societies that developed in the late 20th century in Europe, these are much equal than most other state societies. And I think it's very reasonable to believe that we can move much farther in this direction.
So two things jump out at me from what you just said there. And I'll ask them, and we'll end this segment on these two, your answers to these. One is, it seems to me that from what you stated, that endemic or systemic within the ideas of the inequality is natural is a non-secular belief. So, i.e., are secular societies generally more free? And secondly, that it seems from what you've said that equality or equal societies do not do well scaled up. They're not scalar. So can you address both the secular and the scalar ideas?
Well, the relationship between religion and inequality is very interesting, because most religions, at least most of our Western religions, the Abrahamic faiths, are all based on this egalitarian ideal of the equality of at least of all believers, if not of all people. But yet, if you look at most Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Mormon, and other Abrahamic societies, you find they're highly hierarchical and unequal. They find some excuse to say, oh, actually, well, yeah, we're in some sense we're all equal, but really in the sense of which some people have lots and lots of power and wealth, that we're not going to be equal in that sense. There's always to be some excuse. And other religions, of course, there have been some religions that are really based on ideas of high inequality, such as the ideas that pervaded in the West before the Abrahamic faith, the religions saying the Pharaoh is God or the Emperor of Rome is God. Obviously, these are clearly based on justifying high inequality, but there, of course, have been secular societies that are just as unequal as religious societies. The Soviet Union had, like Christianity, the Soviet Union started with an ideal of equality. Oh, we're all workers, we're all proletarians here. Oh, but the dictator has to be in charge. Yeah. Oh, and we need a party apparatus to control everything. Of course we need that. And then that ends up being, in a lot of ways, more unequal than the Western societies. You get that in Maoist China. Now you get an extreme way in North Korea, where it's really North Korea is developing is already effectively, in all but name, is developed into a hereditary monarchy. So secular societies without religion have proved themselves very capable of doing this, of creating an ideology of inequality. So you can do it with religion, you can do it without religion. You can do it either way.
And regarding the idea of scaling up, the bigger the societies get.
The bigger societies have tended to be more unequal. Well, okay, that's not everywhere and always true. compared to medieval societies, modern Finland and Norway are actually very large-scale societies, but they're much more equal than medieval Europe was. There is a tendency, and the very smallest societies of less than 1,000 people are almost always very equal. Once you get larger than that, you can get very extreme inequalities. Usually when you get into the tens of thousands, it's going to be fairly equal, but even then you can have slavery and despotism. And once you get into the hundreds, thousands, and millions, somehow it gets very easy to establish despotism. And you have to work really, really hard in a large society to maintain equality. But there are historical examples that show it is possible to maintain much more equality than we have now.
I want to you mentioned eugenics and you talk about it in your book. And before we talk about what's in the book, one of the things that I sometimes find troubling is that there's no doubt that eugenics has historically been used poorly, both in the US and in Germany. But I've often gotten into arguments with people who are totally against it just on principle. And I said, well, in the coming years, couples are going to be able to make a choice whether, scientists, doctors can go in utero and do some therapies on fetuses that will prevent them from getting certain diseases, hereditary diseases that come in the family, and so on and so forth. And that technically speaking is eugenics. So I've always said that eugenics is sort of like a hammer. It can be used for the good or the ill. So when you write about eugenics, and historically, certainly it has been used from people who don't even really, I don't think even really understood it. But you would admit just that eugenics can be used for the good. It just hasn't been, correct?
Well, eugenics, as we know it, no. Genetics, maybe. Now, so genetics is defined, as I understand it, genetics is defined as understanding human heredity, or understanding heredity of all animals, and being able to use our understanding of that maybe to cure diseases or understanding how our bodies and our minds work. That seems like it can have some fairly benign uses. What eugenics was the idea of improving humanity by selective breeding. I don't think there's any role in improving humanity by selective breeding. So no, in that sense, I would say I'm clearly completely against eugenics, although not necessarily against all aspects.
But let me just add, because let me just put that way, this way. I, for example, knew a family of dwarves, and let's say if they were reproducing, and in 20 years, someone could say to the two dwarves who are that your son can be normal sized, and within 40 or 50 years, this catches on. And I mean, dwarves live very painful lives. You wouldn't want to be that person in the room telling that dwarves who got married and wanted to reproduce that if they could have a non-dwarf child and they could, their insurance or whatever could pay for it, you would not want to say, well, you can't do that, right?
No, I wouldn't say you. I wouldn't want to say you can't do that, but I also wouldn't want to do the kind of things we've done, like, well, we're going to go around sterilizing dwarves.
Yeah, no.
We're going to sterilize blind people, or we're going to sterilize people that we deem to be less intelligent, and that's what we were doing.
Yeah.
We were still doing that. When I was born. And when you look at the genetics movement was based on really primitive understanding of genetics. They knew that some traits were heritable. They didn't know which ones, and they didn't know which traits were inheritable and which weren't, and they didn't know how. They didn't know what a gene was. They had an isolated gene, and what their strategies amounted to was to get privileged people to have more children and to get less privileged people to have fewer children. That's all it amounted to. It was really extremely primitive idea. Now, genetics is becoming more and more sophisticated, and in our understanding of genetics, there's good and there's bad. If you can cure a disease that people don't want to suffer from, that is a good disease. Now, there's also a lot of danger in it. There's a lot of danger in it as well. But what we want to avoid in all of this is what eugenics was an excuse for saying this group is eugenically good and that group is eugenically bad. It was just another excuse for inequality, and the idea that that a person who's a dwarf is any less for being shorter. Maybe they have. I didn't actually know. This is the first I've heard that it's painful to be a dwarf. I don't know if it's
Well,
painful.
yes, because dwarves, for example, have to have their bones broken to grow normally. And so I knew I worked with a kid, and he went through like 7 or 8 operations to deliberately break his bones so that he could grow. So it's
but the idea of dwarves being any less worthy of reproducing, absolutely, absolutely, that's the kind of thing that we need to avoid.
And you talk about Galton and Darwin and genius being inherited. Yet, for me, when I think about it, probably the best example I could use that goes against that is Thomas Jefferson. And famously, it's almost a dead certainty that he had at least one, if not multiple, children with Sally Hemings. And when they have gotten together with the black side and the white side of the family, well, whatever you want to think of Jefferson as a slaveholder, whatever you want to think, he certainly was a brilliant human being, full of the inherent biases of his time. But you cannot deny the man was an important intellectual figure of his day. That said, there doesn't seem to be on the black nor the white side anyone remotely approaching his stature of, if you want to call greatness in terms of impact intellectually on either side, which seems to me to debunk the idea that just because you get 2 people with high IQs, you're going to get a Superman.
Yeah, and that's one of the failings of of eugenics, and to some extent genetics as well, to assume too much in inheritance. That a lot of traits are inherited, but actually a lot of that inheritance is also influenced by environment. And the environment doesn't just change little things. It rewires your brain. If you grow up poor, your brain will rewire in different ways. If you're growing up constantly under stress, and poor is one of the ways, growing up in poverty is one of the ways to do that, your brain will rewire and you'll actually be less intelligent than someone who grows up in more favored circumstances with better nutrition and so forth when they're growing up. And that is an outcome of environment. So there's so much more. There's so much more to do with environment. And we think that, our environment changes. Well, we can just learn to overcome them. Actually, no, very often we can't. That retroviruses rewire our system. That RNA is as important as DNA, and that rewires our system. Inheritance is only a small part of it.
Yeah, I was recently arguing with a cop on an online forum regarding one of the more recent killings of a black person. There was this teenage girl named, I think her name was Makai, and she was shot by a cop. And if you watch the video, it's clear that the cop wasn't a Derek Chauvin, but he was poorly trained. And I was arguing with this cop who then clearly displayed his biases, talking about crime being so high and black on black crime, as if other people of other groups don't prey mostly upon their own. And his basic argument was that these people, meaning blacks, but in any case, they're more prone to crime and whatnot. And I said, you can go and look at the poverty statistics anywhere around the world, and the people, whatever group that has the higher level of poverty, there's going to be more crime. And this seems to be an obvious, this is nurture. This is the environment impinging upon people. Black people are not more prone to crime naturally. It's their situation within the context of this country and the historical and political and the financial ramifications that have come down. So, can you talk a little bit about something like that?
Yeah, well, that actually, that framing of black on black crime, which certainly blacks commit crimes against other black people, that although there is a fact that black on black crime does something, is this framing of white people talking about black on black crime and getting blacks to talk about black on black crime, but getting black people to talk about black on black crime is a racist framing. And let me give you an example of how it's a racist framing. We use that as an excuse not to talk about white on black crime. We say, oh, well, we don't, police killing black people, not a big deal because black on black crime, that's the real problem. We will say that. We'll never say Arab terrorism is not a big deal because white on white crime, that's a problem. 19 terrorists hijack 4 planes, kill a few thousand people, many of them white, and we go on a 20-year war, supposed war on terrorism, but a war on lots of people around the world, many of whom had nothing to do this, with lots of civilian casualties of people who had no intention, no connection to this. And nobody says, let's not bother with this because white on white crime, that's the real problem. But if you look at who is killing white people in America, it is white people. The vast majority of white people who are killed are not killed by Arab terrorists. They are not killed by black so-called thugs. They are killed by other white people. White on white crime isn't a phrase you ever hear. And you hear this phrase black on black crime all the time. That's what makes the phrase black on black crime a racist phrase.
Yeah, and if you talk about white on white crime, if white people generally have more access to power, well, you're going to get, who is the scam artist who ran that big pyramid scheme a few years ago and went to jail?
Bernie Madoff.
Yeah, Madoff. So you're telling me Madoff, whose crime wasn't quote unquote violent, but affected tens of thousands of people, bankrupted people, drove people to suicide. He's not violent, but some punk who might happen to be Hispanic or black, who is maybe a junkie or something, that robs a 7-Eleven and maybe in the getaway shoots someone who happens to die, that kid is somehow worse than Madoff. I've never understood this idea of, I can understand what people say, well, Madoff didn't take a gun and shoot someone, but that's just because Madoff was able to get out of that system. And to me, Madoff, people like him are far worse because they have the means and they're given the ability to live good, decent lives, and they blow it.
Yeah, and there's also, Madoff's crime is fairly nonviolent. Yeah, it did ruin a lot of people's lives, but there's also, there are a lot of white people who pick up guns and knives and shoot or stab people. But there's also a lot of white collar crime that really does kill people. The people who are putting toxins in our environment are almost all wealthy white people, and they are killing people left and right. They're killing lots of out-group people. They're running their toxic pipelines through Indian reservations, but they're also when they can't find another route, they'll run it through a white neighborhood. We have lots of toxic waste dumps that are killing people. We have toxins in our land, in our water, in our air, and there's white people doing that, and that is very much like a wanton murder. We pretend that these things aren't killing people, and they are. And if you actually counted those, if you counted all of that environmental killing as murders, I'm sure that white on
human crime
people are the biggest murderers in the United States, both white on white and white on black and everybody else.
Yeah, I ended my argument with that cop saying, just answer me this one question. This was a fight between 2 black girls. One girl pulled out a knife. The cop shot the one black girl. And I said, if those 2 girls who had been fighting, and it had been 2 white girls, the cop would never have even pulled out his gun. And I said, but anyway, I wanted to then go on page 45. I wanted to read something that you wrote and have a comment from you on it here. So you write on page 45, Rothbard 2012, for example, writes, in every organization or activity, A few, generally the most able and or most interested, will end up as leaders, with the mass of the membership filling the ranks of the followers. He employs the Burkean conservative claim that prejudices reflect accumulated intuitive wisdom, supposing that redheads are excitable, that men are really natural leaders, and that women are better at jobs requiring housewifely skills, patience, sex appeal, and contact with children, et cetera, et cetera. And I, as someone who's worked in and out of corporate America, the very idea that the best rise to the top, is laughable. I mean, yes, in the sense maybe the guy who carries the biggest club and can club people, but that isn't real leadership. That's just brutishness, to use the term that you had mentioned, the Hobbesian term. So talk about, first of all, the fellow Rothbard and his book and what I just read there, how you take that on.
Yeah, well, Murray Rothbard is, I really got to have some background on Murray Rothbard. He is part of the group of people who call themselves libertarians. And I prefer the term propertarian because they don't actually promote liberty. They promote property and they say that that promotes liberty, and it does not, in fact, promote liberty. You have to interfere with and coerce people to create the private property system that these so-called libertarians want to see. And when you do that, you make them less free, and people who go by this name always ignore that loss of freedom and just start with the freedom where a bunch of people owning a bunch of stuff, everybody else having nothing, ignoring all the violence and the coercion and the interference that went to creating this starting point. And Jen just saying, any deviation from this natural system, any deviation from that harms freedom. And that's why we're for freedom. Well, you're not actually for freedom. If that's what you're for property rights. And Murray Rothbard is a very extremist. He is a very extremist supporter of this idea. And he is not the only propertarian that I discuss in this book. He's the most extreme one. It's always easy to get a good quote from him because he'll say all sorts of extremist stuff. But I look at much more moderate propertarians, and they're all really beginning with this idea that property is natural and that coercion against property, that's real coercion. But the coercion you have to establish this property right system, well, that doesn't go. Forget that. That's ancient history. Even though it's going on every single day that we maintain this system. So Murray Rothbard is this very extreme example of that. And what I used to show by some quotes by him and by Robert Nozick and several other people is that they want to say that it's about freedom. But they also will take these eugenic ideas and these conservative ideas and these meritocratic ideas, and they'll want to say that, they'll want to give the impression that by rewarding property owners, we really are rewarding meritorious people. Then they'll say, oh, well, but we're not really saying that. We're not committed that we really want meritocracy, and they really want to have it both ways. They want to imply that buying, selling, trading will reward the people who do the best stuff. And then they'll say, oh, no, that's not what it's about. So that gives them a chance to run from various arguments. So when they want to say, oh yeah, you're taking from the people who do good when you have this. And they say, oh, we don't have to defend that the system actually rewards people that do good. So they run back and forth from different premises and aren't really very upfront about that. And I think a lot of them aren't clear in their own mind, the extent that every once in a while they say, oh, I'm against meritocracy. Then they pull out these meritocratic arguments. And you see that in Rothbard, and you see that in Nozick, where Nozick uses, Robert Nozick uses a Wilt Chamberlain example, somebody that rises from nothing to be this great basketball player. And he uses a Henry Ford example, this guy who made all these cars that we all drove. And he doesn't use an example of some landlord that has a toxic waste dump and gets rich off of having buildings that are fire traps and where people can get low rent, but then a certain percentage of them die in fires or their children eat lead paint. So Rothbard and Nozick, they want to portray the system as meritocratic and then claim that they're not really portraying it that way at all.
I found the Will Chamberlain example by Nozick, particularly for me, galling for this reason. I grew up as a sports fan. I remember Will Chamberlain in his later years as a basketball player, and the idea that Will Chamberlain was adored shows that this guy probably never saw Will Chamberlain play, knows nothing about his career, because Chamberlain was, first off, with even in the context of basketball, Chamberlain was slighted by Bill Russell of the Celtics, who won a lot of championships. Chamberlain only won 2. So even within the sports context against his peers, he was always slighted. And I think Will Chamberlain, I could make a good argument that he was the greatest athlete of the 20th century. But within the racial context of America, Will Chamberlain was he was quite arrogant in a sense about who he was, and he was a great basketball. He'd say he was a great basketball player. He later made the claim about sleeping with 20,000 women. I mean, a lot of the people, they looked at him as an uppity nigger, to use the old term, and he was not what Michael Jordan became. He was not beloved like a lot of more latter day. I even remember seeing a show when he appeared on a game show in the 1950s, a year or two ago, and he's 7'1", and they were still treating him as if he was a child. And so the idea that Will Chamberlain was adored by America is just a total fantasy. And it got me thinking, I wonder how many of the claims in your book, whether they're like this or not, are just basically people taking ideas or whatnot and not even really investigating them. Because I can't imagine anyone who knows anything about the history of American sports, basketball, and Will Chamberlain particularly, could make that such an idiotic claim.
Yeah. And that, I think that definitely is a pattern. Black people in the United States being appreciated after they're gone, or after they're much more than when they're active. So Muhammad Ali was widely hated by white people when he was a boxer. It was only after he retired and stopped bragging that people look back. Oh, actually, this is a great guy. Martin Luther King, after he's assassinated, white people want to treat him as a saint, but he was a hugely controversial figure right up until the end. And that is certainly a pattern.
I want to jump a little bit ahead of the book here, but one of the things I wanted to pick up, even though I don't know if you specifically address it in the book, I live in Texas. And one of the things that I've always found amazing about Texas society, and I'm sure you probably know about the debacle we had this past winter where we got 2 or 3 inches of snow and the state basically shut down because of the electrical system. The power grid was basically bargained off to a bunch of millionaire assholes years ago, and the rest could drop dead. But anyway, the thing that I found the most impressive about the way Texas is structured in a negative sense is that the people at the very poorest bottom, and this includes a lot of poor rural whites, they have been snookered so much that they believe that they're just temporarily displaced millionaires, that they somehow deserve to not have electricity if something bad goes wrong, that they deserve to what little crumbs are doled out. And they are played off against Mexicans or blacks or other people and say, look, if you don't like it, you could end up like them. So if you could maybe talk a little bit, even if it wasn't particularly in the book, about what I see as the way people are manipulated by sort of threats or quasi-threats that, if you don't behave, you can always go down a rung by the people in power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that has some parallel to what I was saying about this claim that native peoples live lives that are solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, is used as an excuse for maltreatment of both of native peoples and for the least advantaged people in our society. The native peoples, their lives are really bad. The state can go in and do all kinds of violence to them, and it's going to end up they're going to get a better life out of it, supposedly. And then you, the least advantaged person in our society. At least you're a white person. At least you are one of us, and you're not one of those people, and you're much, much better off. As bad as your circumstances are, we're telling you it'd be much worse if you started out the way they did. Actually, a lot of Native peoples were doing just fine before colonialists came around and started doing violence to them. And it's just a lot of propaganda that they were constantly at war with each other, and propaganda by the big war machine of the Western colonial powers. Now we see in contemporary society, we come with some sort of parallel to this, that we have, the United States has a highly racialized society, but also a highly unequal society in terms of wealth and a lot of class differences. And what people have successfully done is playing lower class whites off against lower class blacks and Hispanics and Native Americans and other groups, to telling the white people, however poorly off you are better off than them. And that's sort of the function that especially black people have had in the United States, it seems to me, people bring up this issue, is it race or class? Well, actually, race is a class. It seems to me the United States was created with, you got your upper class, your middle class, your lower class, and then you have black people. Yeah. And black people were born here to be the extra low class. Yeah. And that plays off, that means that they do the absolute worst stuff, and then we can tell the white people that, look, you're better off than them. Protecting what you have is really important against those black people that are just a step below you. They want to take what you have, and what you need to do is to come to allegiance with the better off people against those people who are probably going to take it. And you see a lot of the prejudice against black people, a lot of racists against black people comes in two ways. One is that seeing them as part of this extra low class and being and doing the type of behavior that we expect of the extra low class. Oh, well, you're really uneducated and you live poorly and so forth, doing all these things. But the other is punishing people for not being that, for punishing people for not fitting into that, for actually owning a business, for actually moving up in society, so they're either being punishing for deviating from this being the extra low class, or being treated as what people expect of those who deserve to be in the extra low class. And getting beyond this division is what the United States really needs to do, to get all of the people to see that this division is artificial, that we do not need an extra low class. We do not need anyone to be our Negro, as the recent phrase says, is that creating this idea and playing these classes off of each other has worked very well. It's worked very well to prevent solidarity for the people that really need to be in solidarity, the less privileged people of all races. And that's why I think fighting racism is fundamental to making America a better place for everyone. And white people need to see that as much as anyone else.
Yeah, I wanted to talk. I've often thought that whether you're talking communism, whether you're talking anarchism, whether you're talking feudalism or capitalism, that all of those ideas seem to be based upon a PELF, P-E-L-F, a PELF-centered idea that there is a thing somehow beyond or fundamental that everyone wants. And I don't know how you could get beyond that. I think one of the ways for equality, my own idea, is that you'd have to have a PELF-less based economy or society. I don't know how we get there, but it seems to me that economic mobility, even if you were to get rid of PELF, the idea of PELF, if you're talking about the racialized idea of a black underclass or any other group that is a class unto itself, that seems to fly in the face of the idea that there could be any economic mobility. So how do you get economic mobility if people are just by want of birth, permanently an underclass in a society?
And the fault, I mean, the fault of this is clearly with the white people. It's the white people that need to change. Blacks have been constantly asking for solidarity from the rest of us for hundreds of years and gotten their hands slapped every time. Someone said, I think it was a sports figure, a coach, I think, who said, I can't remember who said it, in response to George Floyd last summer. A black person, I think it was a coach, said, we've always loved this country, and this country has never loved us back. And that really is such a great summation of the black experience in the United States, is that there's so much benefit for white people for looking at what are black people saying, what are their complaints, and if you fix black people's complaints, that's also going to help white people. Police kill they kill more black people than they kill white people. But police in the United States kill more white people than police in Canada kill white people, or police in Sweden or Norway or Britain kill white people. If we do the kind of reforms that black people are asking for, white people are going to benefit from them themselves, except for the white people that want to be killer cops or something. Or and it's the inability of white people to see 2 steps ahead, that a society that doesn't have all these divisions is a better society. What so many white people are thinking is that these divisions are natural, and that more for the people on the other side of this divide means less for the people on this side of the divide. And what we need to see is that we don't have to have these divisions, that we have created them. We have created a system where there's a race on top, and then there's these other races that fill these various roles, and we don't have to look at it this way. That we don't have to create a system where one race is on top. And what white people so often want to think of, that the problem we have is we have a bunch of races here that don't like each other. That is not the problem. It is not the problem that some whites hate some blacks and some whites hate all blacks and some blacks hate all whites. That is not the problem. The problem is that the white race is on top and is putting other races into these various roles. And it is doing that not only to harm these other races and get benefits for whites, but also to justify maltreatment of the kind of people you're talking about in Texas, the maltreatment of white people that are just worried about losing their step or assuming they're eventually going to move up.
Yeah. Getting back to the early in the book when you were talking about more nomadic societies, clearly I would guess they are not based upon what I call pelf. So is the idea?
Tell me what pelf is.
Pelf is money, currency. It's a thing of exchange. So pelf is the idea that there is a fundamental thing in all kinds of currency. I've always said we need a currency beyond pelf, and I guess if you're doing barter, there's still, I guess, the idea. So is there fundamentally a human assumption that's wrong economically, that we are basing things upon, whether it's the gold standard or fiat money now, or I'm just asking you here. You're the expert.
Yeah, well, actually, this isn't something that we touch on in our book, but
yeah.
David Graeber does in his book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, where that debunks our idea of what money is. Uh-huh. And that is based on a lot of other theories of money, but he does it historically, looking at time by time and what's going on with money. Money, there is no such thing as a barter economy. There is no historical observations of a barter economy or something developing from barter into a monetary economy. Small-scale indigenous societies don't tend to barter. They tend to share things out on a centralized scale. And even you get into fairly large economies that are still doing this at a much larger way. If you were a medieval peasant, you didn't really deal with money. You grew these crops, you grew these crops, you raised these animals, you built this stuff, and then you had to give some portion of it to a lord. And that was all in kind. That really, the money existed in medieval Europe, but it didn't play a big role in the lives of most average people. And the way you create money, it doesn't develop by, you have a barter economy, and then there's a gold merchant that starts giving you gold certificates, as this story that we're told about the history of money that never existed. David Graeber has the best example. If you want, you should create a money economy. Say that you need people to feed and house your army. You need to move your army off to the frontiers of your country, and you need them to be fed and clothed. Well, you could order a bunch of people to follow the army and feed and clothe them. But another thing you could do is you could give the army tokens and call it money. And then you could give all the people that live in the countryside, give them a tax obligation that you've got to get some money and give it to us in taxes. Give it to the central government in taxes. So they just give the soldiers money, give the people a tax obligation that they got to get some of that money and give it back to the government, and then you've created a money economy. And in the process, you've gotten the army fed and clothed as it moves out to the frontiers of the country. That is how you create money. You create money from the central government creates the money system. It doesn't grow out of barter or anything like that.
There's a famous quote by a French anarchist, I think it's Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, that says, "Property is theft." And in your book, you're dealing often with people like the Rothbards who would say that taxation is theft. And it seems to me that the people who believe that taxation is theft have no idea of a concept of the commonweal. The richest person in the world, whether it's some Saudi sheikh, whether it's Putin, whether it's Bezos, still doesn't have nearly enough money to build the infrastructure that his business can run by himself. They are utterly, totally, 100% dependent upon other people, upon the commonweal. So it seems to me implicit in a lot of your argument against people like Rothbard, they seem to either have never heard this idea or care about it, or they're just like, fuck it all, it's just about me. So could you talk a little bit about that mindset that the Rothbardian proprietarians have and how they seem to be so scornful of what I would call the commonweal?
Well, what these so-called libertarians, the proprietarians, will do is they tend to just ignore their critics. They tend to talk amongst themselves and just kind of ridicule their critics and not really pay much attention to their critics, and then making their ideas sound that when they only talk in their echo chamber, it makes their own ideas sound scientific and secure and well thought out. They would, to the extent that they will attack other people, they'll attack them from their own premises, but very often ignoring people who attack their premises. So the people who look at my work tend not to be libertarians. Libertarians have not very well defended themselves against these now 2 books and several articles that I've written attacking this idea. They just simply ignore it. So they have this idea that what they say about property is all there is to say on it. So people like Rothbard are starting from this premise that the property rights system is natural, that a private property rights system is natural, and that then any interference with that is theft. And one of the key arguments of the book that we go through in the last part of the book is 5 chapters going through the history of property from prehistory through the earliest ancient societies, from the later antiquity societies of Greece and Rome, through the medieval period, the colonial period, and what's going on today, to show that the private property rights system was not created by people who went out and naturally wanted to do it and naturally appropriated property as this Lockean story would have it. What happened was that the people who first mixed their labor in the land, the person who really first went out in the woods and cleared it, did so in small groups of a few hundred people. And they cleared the land. They shared the land amongst everyone in the group. Everyone in the group had a right to have a certain plot of land, but not to own it, but to farm it for the summer. And then they'd have a right to maybe another plot the next summer. And you find variations on this theme throughout really the entire world of agriculture. Village agriculture, where every member of the village has a right to farm it, but not to, necessarily to any particular plot. You find this in Africa, you find this in Europe, you find this in the Americas, you find variations of it in India, and all kinds of places around the world, including in Europe prior to the what we call the enclosure movement. But now the variations on it tend to be how much of a parasitic layer is on top of it. You find some little villages in remote areas where there's barely a leader at all, and you find people who are essentially sharing the land as a community of several hundred people. Then you can get a parasitic chief on it who is taking some of that, using some of that for the defense of the people, but also just using some of that to make himself chief and paying the warriors that protect him as chief. In medieval Europe, you get some advantage of it where there's a very strong parasitic layer put on top of it, especially in Russia in the early modern period where you have serfdom and so forth. And we have this strong parasitic layer, but still very often the serfs interacting amongst themselves are still very much doing this village agriculture, and this lord on top is taking from. That is where what the original appropriators established around the world. They either established hunting grounds or they established this community agriculture. To get from there to the private property rights system, what you have is a campaign of violence, both within Europe in the enclosure movement and outside of Europe in the colonial movement. In enclosure, what they did was they took these little village agricultures and that little lord on top, and they said, actually, the lord has always been the owner of the land. You all have just been his tenants, and your rights really don't count. He should have 100% complete control over the land, and you either pay rent to him, or you become his employees, or he can kick you off the land. That was a very violent struggle throughout Europe for about 500 years, from like the 1400s to the 1900s, to complete this conversion in Europe and to make the lords into landlords, the lords of Europe into landlords, and take away the rights that the genuine descendants of the appropriators, the people, had established over that land at the village level. It was violent, and it was done. It was violent. It was oppressive. It was done to benefit the lords, and not just to benefit the lords by giving them control of the land, but because the lords knew if they controlled the land, they controlled the people. Because the people, once the land is entirely owned by the lords, the people are dependent on the lord to get a job. They intentionally created a dependent situation where the lord owns the land, and then all of the people have to go to the lord to get a job. And the people then, they might have a choice of which lord to work for, but they're essentially a forced laborer. They have to work at a wage labor job. And we're so used to this that we think of this, oh, that's a free labor market. Well, that's a choice of masters. A choice of masters is not freedom.
Yeah.
That's how we made the conversion in Europe. Outside of Europe, we made the conversion by Western powers sending their guns and their ships around the world and establishing eventually the same private property right system by taking the people off the land and telling them, if you want anything, you've got to go and work for first the Lord and then the corporation that we've given ownership of a land in your country. That is the violent system that we got to create the kind of property right system today. We did it for the benefit of the European upper class, and it continues to benefit the upper classes around the world today at the expense of the people who've been disappropriated and are thereby forced by this system we've created to become wage laborers. When they do not have the option to be their own proprietor, to start their own cooperative, to start their own business. They must become wage laborers. That's the system that we've created. That's the property rights system as we know it. And it has nothing to do with any natural development.
Yeah, there's lots in your books, and we're not going to be spending hours. So I want a couple of other, 2 or 3 other major points. One of the things I mentioned, Will Chamberlain, how I thought how absurd it was the idea that he was adored and beloved. But probably just looking at my notes here and going to the next thing that I had, you talk about some of these proprietarian type ideas, and they try to make comparisons to the animal kingdom in regards to territoriality. You use 5 examples to debunk that. But the whole thing, again, seems so absurd, because the idea that an animal can even consider or could even formulate an idea of what property... I mean, a hyena pisses on the territory. A male lion isn't going to give rat's ass that that's the hyena's territory. And the idea that they could somehow... the lions and hyenas could sit down and say, well, you have the left side, west side, and we have the north and east sides, is absurd. And yet it seems that these proprietarian idea, it seems almost absurd that they would even use animals in this idea, because an animal can't even conceive of property. Yeah. So the 5 ways that you debunk it, if you could just maybe go through them quickly, and why was this proposed as this is this just the idea that, again, we're on top, it's natural?
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of efforts that this idea that property is natural, at least proprietarians have made some effort to say that it's natural. But most people who cite any evidence on this will be citing Hayek. And Hayek wrote a few paragraphs on this. He cited 3 authors, and very few of these proprietarians will actually look at the authors he cited. Well, we did. We looked at those authors, and those authors, what they say does not back up what Hayek said. He mostly misinterpreted his sources, and this is to look at the idea that property begins with appropriation and so forth. But there have been other people that we mentioned in the book. They're trying to say that this is actually something that not just humans do, but animals do. That there's a property instinct, that animals tend to have property. And what he does, what this author does, he's trying to say that there's a property instinct. He looks extremely selectively through the animal kingdom to try to find animals that have something that looks like property. So he mentions a type of spider, spiders will more likely defend their nest. So spiders will, a certain species of spider that will fight to take over other spiders' nests. And they're more likely to defend the nest they have than to attack somebody else's. If they're a wandering spider that doesn't have a good spot, they're more likely to defend than attack. And that, he says, you see, this shows that this spider believes that he has property. Well, actually, psychology explains this with status quo bias. It doesn't really necessarily have anything to do with the notion that this is mine. And the mere fact that spiders do have to fight it out very often, it shows that spiders don't actually respect an idea of property rights. Yeah. And this same spider who will, if he defends his nest, he or she defends his nest and loses, will go out and try to fight some other spider. So clearly, it doesn't have a notion of property. And another one, they look at other apes. Apes do have strong territories. They have strong territories, and they have powerful leaders very often. Actually, ape foragers tend to be more hierarchical than human foragers. Human foragers tend to be some of the least hierarchical humans there are, but apes will tend to fight their way to the top. But apes do not negotiate their territory. They do not have a notion. They have a notion that we control this territory and this ape group over there controls that territory, and we will fight it out. But they do not have a notion that they have a just claim on their territory and we have a just claim on our territory. It's all might makes right, fighting their way up the ladder. The idea that the top ape owns the territory is not respected by any other ape. The ape at the top is at the top because he fought his way. Well, if he fought his way, he doesn't respect property. But this is just looking at the animals that have the most property-like institutions, and even they're not good representatives. But this author doesn't go at all. He doesn't look at herding animals. Herding animals have this big herding territory that they all go and they share. They share the land. There's no notion of land ownership in herding animals. He simply just doesn't mention them. He'll jump from spiders to monkeys and apes as if he's tracing an instinct through evolution. Oh, he's just ignored more than half of the animal kingdom because they don't fit his model.
Well, yeah, and you could see on the American plains centuries ago, buffalo peaceably coexisting with deer and wild horses and other animals. Let me just get onto a couple of things before I wrap up. The idea of inheritance. What is your take on inheritance, and what role does it play within propertarian philosophy, if you will?
Yeah. Well, property. You brought up Prudhomme, who said, "What is?" He asked the question, "What is property?" and answered it with, "Property is theft." And I don't go that far because something has to be owned first before it can be stolen. And what I describe property as, property is an obligation, is a duty. When you are saying this land is my land and it's not yours, you're imposing an obligation on the other person. Now, obligations are fine if they're mutually agreeable. If I say, okay, if you and I are stranded on an island, we could decide, we could say, okay, this half of the island is yours, that half's mine, and that's how we're going to do it. I have an obligation to respect yours, you have an obligation to respect mine, we've agreed to it. But we don't have to do it that way. We could say 1/3 of it's mine, 1/3 of it's yours, we share the other third. Or we could say the whole island is shared between the two of us. But all of those are obligations. Whatever rule we make, we're holding the other person to the obligation to obey that rule that we set up, whether it's half and half, 1/3, or share the whole thing. In each of those, we're obliging another person to conform to this rule. Now, obligations generally should be chosen. I mean, my obligation to support your life is one thing. That's that maybe I should never murder you. I probably should never murder you despite there being no agreement. That I should be under obligation to. But this idea that we can take the earth that our ancestors shared for hundreds of thousands of years and then suddenly impose an obligation through war and enclosure and say, this group owns it, that group doesn't. What we're doing is imposing an obligation on the less privileged people of the world. That is what property is. And inheritance is just not only imposing that obligation, but saying that it's an inheritable obligation. That people hundreds of years ago imposed this obligation to create a world of property. And then they can inherit this, and then you are born with an obligation. So born without property in a society that's already divided the world up into property. is being being born with an obligation to the upper class. You will sell your labor to them because there's no other way to survive. You will respect their property rights because there's a police force that will arrest you if you do otherwise. You're born in obligation, and inheritance is passing on that obligation. Now, a property system, that doesn't mean now, Prudhomme's solution was to entirely throw out the property rights system. I don't think that is necessary or desirable. There's some good. I am sitting here on the porch of my father-in-law's home, and it's a really nice place, and I like having this. I can respect the obligation that I don't sit on that guy's porch. He doesn't sit on this porch. That's a mutual obligation. But we can have property that truly is mutual, that is not a one-way obligation from the lower class to the upper class, if we make sure everybody gets a share. So we have to change the market system and get rid of an idea where one group controls all the investments, controls all the businesses, and controls really all of the owned property, and the other group has to be constantly paying for that by paying their labor to this group and then using the pay they get to pay their rent to this other group. We need to get rid of that system. If you call that getting rid of capitalism, then we need to get rid of capitalism. If we call that reforming capitalism, then we need to reform capitalism. I don't care what you call it, but we have to create a system that is based on mutual obligation, not a system of one-sided obligation, which is what we have in the kind of property rights system that we have today.
So let us talk about a couple more things, and then we'll just wrap up and see what you have planned for the future. We've talked about property, basically material things. In recent decades, the idea of intellectual property has become more and more well known in social and society. And I've always thought that, especially things like copyrights, and with Disney fucking around back in '98, extending it to like 95 years, I've always thought lifetime of the creator and then maybe 20 years for his widow or something. But it seems that intellectual property rights are all, again, the rich are trying to take, especially corporations, are trying to make it in perpetuity. What is your take? You don't speak too much about this in the book, but what is your own personal take about intellectual property rights, and are they being screwed around with too by the rich?
Oh yeah, we don't get into intellectual property, but one of the themes throughout the book is the creation of rights is usually for the benefit of whatever group is on the inside, whether it's the Soviet Politburo on the inside or whether it's a U.S. Upper class on the inside. We create these systems of rights for the benefit of the people who make the rules, and it's and there's sometimes collateral benefit from others, but often there's collateral harm that goes to others. And intellectual property is an example of this. They portray it as we're doing this for the creator. Yeah. And that's always, we need intellectual rights to protect creators, but actually the way we've created them makes it actually very easy for corporations and powerful people in the publishing industry or in various aspects of various related industries to control the things that creators make, to get control of them, and then they go to the government to extend the copyright and extend it and extend it and extend it sometimes retroactively. Yeah. So what we've done when we first created copyrights, it was just I think it was 20 years. Yeah. To have a copyright, so you'd write something and you write something when you're 20. By the time you're 40 or 45, I don't know exactly when it was, but it was really short. You would live to see what you've written go into the public domain. Then they extended to lifetime of the person. Then it was lifetime plus 50 years. Now I think they've extended it to 150 years. And they did this not for the benefit of the creators who had already sold their rights or had their rights taken by very nefarious managers without really understanding contracts they were signing. They did it for the benefit of corporations that own things that were created 100 years ago. That's what our copyright system is doing today. And so many of the rules we're making is just trying to find, we have a group that is already privileged, and we're trying to create a set of rules that is going to extend their privilege even farther. We've done this at a really rapid pace over the last 50 years. In one area after another. More government giveaways to the rich, where lower taxes on the rich go on at the same time.
Yeah, right now, currently, the works that were written in 1926 just came into the public domain on January 1st. January 1st is creators call it the public domain day. But let me just ask, since the book ends up talking about UBI, and that was the subject of our first conversation, if you can just briefly sort of wrap up what you think UBI can do to alleviate some of these things that we've talked about.
Well, I don't talk very much in this book about how to fix the system. What I talk about is these arguments that people give for why the system is the way it is are simply not true. And then a little bit at the end about what do we do about it. But I've written other things on this. My earlier book, which you and I haven't talked about, maybe we should sometime. A Theory of Freedom is the Power to Say No. I've talked about that in order to be a genuinely free person, you have to have access to the resources you need to survive. People had this when we were hunters and gatherers, when our ancestors were small-scale farmers. Individuals had this. But once we created this system where a group of owners controls the means that people need to survive and the rest of us have to go to them for jobs, we are akin to being a slave with a choice of masters. Now, being a slave with a choice of masters is a lot better than being a slave with no choice of masters. But it is not being a fully free person. So one of the things that we need to redress the kind of problems that Grant and I have pointed out in these two books is a basic income at least high enough so that people have access to the resources they need to survive. And if they work for somebody, it is because they've been given a good offer for good wages and good working conditions, not because this is the only way to survive. That's one solution. Now, other things that I've written a little bit about, and I intend to write much more in a future book called Justice is the Pursuit of Accord, is that we need to envision the economy is you pay for what you have and you get paid for what other people have. As I said, property is an obligation. Property is a duty. When you create a property right, you're imposing a duty on everyone else to respect the ownership of this person who takes control. If you're going to impose an obligation on everybody else, ideally, you would negotiate with them. If I want to put you under an obligation, I would negotiate with you and say, look, how much do I have to pay you to put you under this obligation? So the people who own, I don't say that nobody should own anything. The people who own are always paying back to the people who don't own in the form of the basic income. So it gives a second argument for basic income. The first argument for basic income is to maintain your freedom by giving you access to the resources you need to survive. The second argument is to compensate you for the fact that we've created a private property rights system and you didn't get a share. It makes sure everybody gets a share. So if you're capable of starting a business and creating a bunch of value, great. Then you go and pay the taxes on that business, and we're going to redistribute that to everyone else so that your business directly benefits everybody else. And it makes sense to put them under obligation because they've directly benefited. They benefited not because, oh, maybe you'll give them a job someday, you'll be a job creator. They benefited because you've paid rent on all the resources you control. And we've redistributed that to all the people who are under the obligation of respecting your rights to control all those resources that you built your business on.
Well, I certainly, any books in the future or in the past you want to send me, I'll read them and we can talk about them. I just wanted to ask one final question about UBI, because one of the things that with universal basic income, especially when Andrew Yang was running for president a year or two ago, there was the idea that it would be funded by specific taxes. And I think that approach is fundamentally flawed because the next guy who gets in charge who doesn't want it could easily corrupt that and get rid of it. Alaska makes money from the wealth of its oil resources, and it has what is more easily called a social wealth fund, i.e. that everyone in the country owns all of the public property resources, and that there should be, a dividend, in other words, by which that universal basic income is funded. So I'm just wondering, what do you think is the best mechanism for UBI? I don't think I think taxation is something that's fundamentally flawed, and that the whole idea of a common ownership within a society is the better idea and more stable.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, yes, I agree that a common ownership society, but not one where the people necessarily directly control the means of production.
Yeah.
But where people own the resources and lease them out to private companies.
Yeah.
So a system where instead of collecting taxes, the government is primarily collecting rent.
Yeah.
Rent on all of the resources, and what comes with that, comes with people's own. But we really need to do an established way that it is the people's ownership, and that if they're reducing this, they are taking away your ownership of the property. We shouldn't be thinking of ourselves as a taxpayer. We should be thinking of ourselves as a joint owner of this land. Now we do need to. Now we of course we need to, but. To establish joint ownership is very complex because everybody needs to get a share. So we can't say we can't let our joint ownership change our recognition that everybody gets a share. That's what they did in highly oppressive societies such as the Soviet Union and Maoist China. They wanted to say it was jointly owned, but it wasn't jointly owned in the sense of the people getting anything from it. Yeah. It was just these people called themselves the Politburo and said that they were doing it in the benefit of people jointly. We need to establish democratic control on one end and the right to everybody to have a share on the other end. Yeah. And in between, people collecting rent, and what then comes along with it, if you establish that the people as owners of the business, owners of the land and the resources that come from the land, you establish that, you also establish the right to regulate it, to say, well, we're going to privatize this land, but we're not going to let you pollute this river next to the land. Absolutely not. We don't want anything in that river. You're not going to be polluting this either. So all environmental regulations follow naturally from the people's ownership of this. The people need to see themselves as having this idea of joint control.
Well, Carl, I will link to your Georgetown University page. Anyone can contact you there. And like I said, hopefully we'll have future conversations. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. So thanks for spending a couple hours speaking with me.
Great talking to you too, Dan. Been really good.